Last week, I talked about Renaissances and hardly mentioned art. That was, of course, essentially to tease you. I'm a great believer in the importance of teasing in these matters. What I'm going to do today is to talk about the end of Renaissances, and I would regard, in many ways, the end of culture, in other words, the 20th and 21st centuries, and I will talk quite a lot about what passes for art, though I would argue, insofar as the name really has any the word really has any proper meaning at all, it's usurped it. Just to remind you of not the end of my lecture last week, but the beginning. I tried to talk about the idea of Renaissance, Renaissances, arguing that our culture, that's to say Western European, and in some ways centrally, I was going to say Anglo, I'd almost say Anglo-Italian. There's a most peculiar relationship between England and Italy, symbolized by everything from E.M. Forster to the Grand Tour and so on. But trying to establish the centrality of revivalism, of the constant going back, which is also a renewal and going forward. And you'll remember I summarized it with the quatrain that comes from the very beginning of that process, and also the encounter between England and Italy, the kind of encounter of Chaucer with the Petrarchan experience, and that extraordinary 4 lines in which he compares the intellectual with the agricultural. I constantly use the word fructifying, fruitful. And he does exactly the same when he says, in just the same way as from the old ground every year new corn comes, so from old books comes this new science, knowledge, which, as I said, it seems to me in those 4 lines, really in those 4 words, constantly repeating old and new, ground, corn, books, a cultural inheritance, new knowledge, forms, ideas. What seems to me to be the absolute central characteristic of the 20th century is the central repudiation of that idea. And that I would argue that everything that's gone wrong is the result of the repudiation of that idea. Now, curiously enough, of course, the area where the notion of descent, of continuity, of standing on the shoulder of giants, of teaching in a quasi-chronological order of subjects remains in the natural sciences and mathematics. It has largely gone from the arts. And I want to look at 2 ways in which we can examine why, when, on the lines, I suppose, of the tainted blood inquiry, who to blame, which peers to defenestrate, and so on. And I want to begin with what is normally regarded, if you go and you talk to every art critic, it's not something I would recommend, but if you must, you will find roughly the same story. The origins of modern art. And I want to investigate that idea now. It was done even in the form of a poll. Everything is nowadays done by polls. I mean P-O-L-L rather than increasingly what's done by P-O-L-Es. You know, it is very important that we distinguish the 2. And it was a poll that was done in the very early days of the Turner Prize, which of course represents the final reductio ad absurdum. This entire process, the infinite nonsense, the overhyped nonsense of the Turner Prize. And it was a poll to ask which was the most influential work of modern art of them all. Can anybody guess the 3? There were 3. The urinal. Pardon? No. Andy Warhol, the Marilyn Triptych, and Picasso did get a look in with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The order was, I'm afraid, Picasso third, Warhol second, and Duchamp up out front as a kind of headlong winner. It was, and it seems to me that is right. So what we've got to do then is to investigate the phenomenon. I'm going to leave Picasso out entirely because he has some talent. And instead, I'm going to focus on the relationship between Duchamp and Warhol. It's a very, very close one, and it's far too frequently forgotten. Marcel Duchamp is a Frenchman who, like so many other people who weren't terribly keen on the First World War, fled. He fled to America. And there he is at the center of a movement which is called Dadaism. And Dadaism is, and let's get this quite clear, it is a very comprehensible reaction to the horror of the First World War. The first thing that we need to understand about it is its essentially nihilistic nature. This is the paradox. The person who is supposed to have founded modern art passionately disbelieved in the idea of art and went out of his way to attack it as much as possible. And indeed, Dadaism was much broader than simply talking about art. It argued that the First World War and its horror undercut essentially, and this again is interesting, isn't it? If you look at conventional accounts of where the world changes, indeed the horror of the First World War is precisely that. And again, A.J.P. Taylor on the origins of the bureaucratic state in Britain, the extraordinary world of the pre-First World War, where a gentleman could go an entire lifetime without having very much to do with the state, to the extraordinary shift within a mere 10 years after that. Anyway, but the Dada movement was about arguing that the entire foundations of society, art, culture, reason, the lot, had been so completely undercut by the horror of the First World War that they had to be abandoned. In other words, it is from the beginning nihilistic. So how on earth can you found something, the most important work of modern art, if you're nihilistic? How can nihilism, because that's what it is, found something? So let's actually look, summarize. Clearly, many of you are familiar. There was an exhibition in New York of some very well-meaning centrist art society, and Duchamp submits a urinal, which is turned upon its side, is entitled Fountain, and is inscribed R-Mut, R-M-U-T. What is he doing? Is this a new way of looking at the world? What we've got to understand is he was consistently and absolutely certain that his was a work not of construction, not of artistic activity, but of destruction. And once again, it really is time that we paid attention to what he wrote and what the other Dadaists wrote and what they actually said. In other words, the way we normally present this is purely retrospectively. It's purely turning the thing back. We need, as it were, to turn it forwards. And he is quite clear he is not an artist. The thing that he is most passionate about is, I am not an artist. He's again, very like Orwell in the Second World War, he's very interested in language. He is bilingual. He constantly, if you look at his writings, his natural writing is a bizarre sort of franglais, moving between English and French. Anyway, and he is very conscious, and he even invents a new word. Dada is very keen on reinventing language, I mean, the very name of the thing. And his favorite word is an artist, A-N, artist, meaning as the same as anarchist. An anarchist is, no law, no, and the opposite of rule, the Greek. So the believer in the absence of rule. An artist is the absence of art. And he goes much further because, again, very like Orwell, he's a vivid phrase maker. Now, the wonderful phrase, really, what's a sublime representative art? Well, it's something like Rembrandt. What should Rembrandts be used for? They should be used for ironing boards. That is a typical Dadaesque aphorism. But at the same time, it's really very important we understand this. Alongside that, and it's quite confusing, that I think he's a genius, a malign genius. There's an astonishing, there's a kind of creativity in the nihilism. Because if you then look at what he actually does, what is the urinal? Well, it is taking what the French call an objet trouvé, what in other words, a found thing. The English form becomes a term of art. Very interesting, an artist inventing a term of art, but that's another matter. Ready-made, the idea of the ready-made, the thing that you just find. So the urinal is presented mockingly as a work of art to show how completely silly, literally to piss. And what it's doing, it's pissing on the idea of art. That's. And one of the things that's most striking about Dada and the whole of the Surrealist movement, which is the grander name for Dadaism, it's astonishingly dirty and over-sexualized quality. I mean, I found myself one of the great moments of pride in my career involving exhibitions and whatever. In the days when I was very much flavour of the month, now of course I'm not even allowed over the threshold of the National Maritime Museum, but in those days I was flavour of the month. Literally true. Literally true. Can we just be serious for 1 second? Literally true. Anyway, I was commissioned by them to do an exhibition for the 400th anniversary of the death of Elizabeth I. And I was lined up against, three guesses whom, the sainted Neil MacGregor, who was then director of the National Gallery, and they wanted funding for an exhibition on the Surrealists, centering on Dada. We wanted an exhibition on Elizabeth I, and the prime supplier of fundraising was, interestingly enough, Morgan Stanley. And myself and MacGregor had to appear. This is how seriously art sponsorship was taken way back at the beginning of the 20th century. We had both to appear in person in front of the full international board of Morgan Stanley in their opulent headquarters. And I'm delighted to say I won hands down. I was then taken aside afterwards and said, "Don't be so smug. Let me tell you the background." The directors had a preview of what MacGregor was wanting to show. One of them said, "We can't possibly show our wives this." So again, because of the hypersexualized nature of the thing. But alongside all, which again is part of the tearing down of hierarchy of value and the inversion. But what is very striking alongside all that, of course, is, as I said, the sheer inventiveness of the man. If you think of what we nowadays call the categories of modern art, he invents all of them in about 3 minutes. He invents the mobile. It consisted of a bicycle wheel and a flashing torch. Right, this was a work of art. He invents kinetic art using the cinema to film the wheel, or alternatively to film a gramophone turntable. Art. He goes beyond that. He, of course, the whole notion of the actual found object is further developed alongside the urinal. The other most important of them was the bottle rack. The bottle rack is absolutely central in the. I have no idea why, but I think lots of things that stick out. Which so if you're being a little bit naughty, he again is fascinated by the idea of, well, charms. Are we familiar with the work of John Cage, the composer, where you actually introduce the element of chance? He introduces quasi-musical instruments, many of them which produce loud farting noises, which are again generated by electrical sparks. This is all 1918, 1919, 1920. And of course, shades of Jason Perry, he loves cross-dressing. He has an alternative ego who is called Eros, c'est la vie. In other words, eros, that's life, but spelt in funny ways. And he's photographed in drag by Man Ray. And I can go on and on and on. Oh, by the way, graffiti, the art of graffiti. He inscribes a moustache on the Mona Lisa. Do you see what I mean? All of this thrown out to mock art, to take literally, as the urinal shows, the piss out of it. Now, war stops, interest stops, and Dada stops, and Duchamp stops. Does anybody, some of you knew about his activities in the First World War, does anybody know what he spends the next 30 years doing? Playing chess. He gives the whole thing up as an absurdity. If you look at photographs of him at this point, one has the vision of the kind of chaotic artist. He's smartly dressed, he's elegant, he clearly has lots of money, or maybe he exploited New York, I have no idea. But there's this extraordinary retreat into an activity of pointless reason, which I suppose chess is. So why have we ever heard of him? Here is all this intense phase of activity in the final stages of the First World War, a complete abandonment of it as recognizing, I would argue, its self-defeating absurdity. Why then does he feature, in the vulgar world of an opinion survey of art critics in, I think it's 2004, with the newly invented Turner Prize? Well, the answer is the 1960s and New York again. This is where Andy Warhol comes in. Because what happens in the 1960s is essentially the new art, which in every way is a rerun on a classically bigger New York, American, fleshed out, hyped up, super up, lots more money scene that reinvents, or rather just repeats, all of the things that that I've been discussing, the kinetic art, the mobile, the aleatoric, that's the business of chance, the cross-dressing, the whole lot, the entire performance is simply rerun. But there's a vitally important difference. It's art. Art. With the pomposity, with the grandiosity, with the New York fundraising, with the balls, with the sponsors. What's happened? How's it done? And most interestingly, what is the reaction of Duchamp? Duchamp was a man who presented himself as, see from that First World War experience, as a man of high moral integrity. That here is somebody reacting against the wicked absurdities of the world. He makes the gesture of protest. It reaches a buffer. It reaches a brick wall. He moves on, retreats into this world of abstract reason. What gets him out of this world of abstract reason? Well, we must be fair to him. To begin with, in 1961, when the whole mad New York scene had just got underway, he's approached by one of the few surviving members of the Dada movement, and words are put into his mouth, in the form of a letter. And it says, surely, Marcel, you're going to say that all of this is simply preposterous. In other words, what Warhol and whatever are doing. I introduced the idea of the ready-made to demonstrate the absurdity of the idea of a work of art. I assumed the cross-dressing and the personality of Pharos, c'est la vie to demonstrate that it's preposterous to talk about an artist as having a named personality and all the rest of it. It went on and on and on, completely logically right. And at the bottom, in the characteristic franglais, there is Marcel saying, c'est vrai, That's true. No, let me get this right. C'est vrai, okay, the absolute characteristic Franglais. However, the devil in the form Mephistopheles, the tempter, appears in the form of an art gallery agent. And this. He rejoices in the wonderful name of Arturo Schwarz. And if you were trying to invent the name of a gallerista, it would be something like Arturo Schwarz. And if you were wanting to invent a place where the seduction happens, could you do better than Milan? It happens in Milan. And there is an exhibition opened in Milan, 1964, New York's well going, Warhol's well going, and whatever, which has the title of Omaggio a Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp is persuaded to come along. They exhibit repros because almost all of the key works had vanished. They were trash. Nobody took them seriously. They were just flung out. One survivor was in the exhibition and 2 reproductions. Marcel was brought along and sort of homage was paid to him. And there is then a most extraordinary development in which there are 2 absolutely contradictory stories, 2 totally contradictory stories. Arturo Schwarz says, of course, the inspirer of the idea that the artistic achievement of Duchamp. Duchamp felt it was about to disappear. It required preservation so that others could, you see what I mean? This preservation so that others could learn from it. And interestingly enough, isn't it odd how things sort of overlap? That the form of preservation took the form of the reproduction of all the outstanding missing works in 10 copies, each one of which was signed not en masse, but Marcel Duchamp, and an exceedingly fancy price was attached to it, of which Duchamp got an adequate proportion and Arturo Schwarz the rather larger proportion. Duchamp, of course, says this is absolutely untrue, and it was he had not only got the proportion, but you see what I mean. In other words, there's this posterior, and I choose my words deliberately, bottom back recreation of this as art. Interestingly, Duchamp, in the next to the last year of his life, he dies in 1968, he was interviewed. And the interview is fascinating. It's a very impressive interview. The interviewer asks him real questions. He asks the questions we would like to put to him. He says, come on, Monsieur Duchamp, when you did all this at first, you were an artist. You were denying the possibility of art. You were denouncing the idea of the artist as a significant figure. You were arguing that Rembrandt's should be used as ironing boards. Why have you changed your mind? What are you doing? What is the logical basis of it? And the answer is wonderful. He giggles. He giggles and says, oh, isn't the contradiction wonderful? That is the moment. But you see what's happened? That extraordinary self-contained integrity of those 30 years playing chess is thrown away for, admittedly, a very large handful of dollars. And what you do then is invert what had been an attack, nihilism, into a new form of art. And the thing that is, of course, striking is that this new art, which had been conceived of as nihilistic, as destruction, then takes over all the institutions of the old art, with all the pretension, the money, the drapery, and the pretense, and the pomposity. Now, how can the Royal Academy fall? What is it that enables this to happen? Well, I think, again, it's worth Because I think, as always, things actually do have explanations if you think about them hard enough. And I suppose, again, in the back of my mind, there is the model, isn't there, of Animal Farm, where there's a remarkably similar process of this. As you know, there is the revolutionary takeover of the farm by the pigs, who, at the end of it, are sitting down having a dinner with the farmers who have actually survived. That it's absolutely impossible to tell the difference between the farmers and the pigs. They've each grown to resemble each other in the same way. If you go to a Royal Academy dinner, it is absolutely impossible to tell. I know, I've been to several, the various kinds of pigs. So what we've got to do, what was it in the old art that enabled this takeover to happen? And it's very interesting to investigate it. And here again, we've been talking about how one might do these things televisually. I think you're seeing from this description now of how very easily you could do this. But let me now give you a piece of how you could do the visual now as an actual analysis of why something as apparently abstract as an institutional takeover can happen. The founder of the Royal Academy, well, there are two of them really. There's Chambers, who is its first secretary, who is the architect, in many ways, the extraordinary, distinguished architect. He's the architect of Somerset House, favourite of George III, helps to teach him architecture and all the rest of it. George III is a very superior version of King Charles in terms of education and artistic achievement. He could actually draw and paint and this sort of thing, as well as trying to. The role of Chambers is very important. But the star figure of the Academy is, of course, the famous Sir Joshua Reynolds. The story of Joshua Reynolds is a remarkable one. He, like me, is a boy from the lower orders, from the remote areas of England, who sort of makes it, and unlike me, doesn't blow it. I come from the far northwest. He comes from the far west. He is an innkeeper's son in Devon, who finishes up, after an astonishingly long life, being buried in St. Paul's with a royal funeral, a full-blown state funeral, and the pallbearers at his funeral, including 3 dukes, 2 marquises, and 3 earls. How do you do that, and how do you beat that? Right. Well, the career is an extraordinary one. He is the first president of the Royal Academy in 1769, isn't it? 1768. Sorry. He is knighted the following year in 1769. I've described the funeral and all the rest of it. But the key thing that he regards as being the most important happens here in this university, in the Sheldonian, when he is given the degree of Doctor of Civil Law, DCL, in 1773. And as a result of that, he paints it is very magnificent. The robes are the same, that wonderful scarlet, magnificent colour of the higher doctorates at both Oxford and Cambridge. And he paints a self-portrait of himself. His self-portraits are wonderful. He's suffering from serious eye problems. He's got these immensely thick kind of Monsignor Gilby or a kind of Velasquez Pope spectacles. There is a bust of, he's leaning on a bust of Michelangelo. The Royal Academy has just acquired the Michelangelo Tondo and all the rest of it. And what would you expect this great artist to be holding? What do great artists hold? A brush? No. He's holding a roll, a scroll. Because what he regards as his greatest achievement isn't his painting, it is, what I'm doing now, a series of lectures. He gives the annual presidential lecture of the Royal Academy from its foundation to almost his deathbed. That's 20-odd years of it. He gives an annual presidential lecture which are called the Discourses on Painting. And they are fascinating. Because what he does, he comes up with the definition that allows Duchamp, and what's that other word that Duchamp gives to what he's doing, that it's conceptual. It is intellectual, as opposed to the merely visual art of the past. Right. Listen to what he does. At the centerpiece of his redefinition of art, he says this, but this is Reynolds. But if you're to train as an artist, just as you have to go to grammar school to learn the rudiments of Latin and Greek, you need to go to the Dutch to learn actually how to paint, how to do the dirty, you know, that business of colors and using brushes and whatever. However, if you actually want to be great, you need to acquire the great style. And for that, you've got to go to Italy. And what you want is a work that's got intellectual dignity. Look at this sudden shift from actual craft skill to some sort of, literally the idea of abstraction. And then this is, he says, what ennobles the painter's art and lays a line between himself and the mere mechanic, and produces those effects in an instant which eloquence and poetry, by slow and repeated efforts, are scarcely able to achieve. This distinction, in other words, the diminution of craft skill, exactly the thing that has gone out of all modern art and all the followers of Warhol and the remote followers of Duchamp. And then he gives this extraordinary definition of beauty. The beauty of which we are in quest, he claims, is general and intellectual. It is an idea which subsists only in the mind. The sight never beheld it, nor has the hand expressed it. It is an idea residing in the breast of the artist, which he is always labouring to impart, and which he dies at last without imparting. Now, that is the outstanding spokesman of the old art. Do you see how it leaves a door absolutely wide open to what follows? Because it seems to me it is finally, I would argue, pretentious nonsense. But pretentious and very influential nonsense, and of course the nonsense much pervaded by art critics. So what I've tried to do there is to show fundamentally the absolute falsity of a notion of modern art. It depends on reinterpreting, standing on its head, something that was designed to destroy, and instead turning it into a new sort of value. I would argue again, using that wonderful phrase from the Bible, by their fruits ye shall know them, that the fruits demonstrate its absurdity. The way in which modern art disappears into, most modern artists simply repeat the same work. In other words, without that fructifying, that fruitful relationship with the past, and modern art essentially is masturbatory. And it can be nothing else. And the absurdities of the Turner Prize, again, making works of art out of elephant shit and whatever. Literally, there are major prizes given for this stuff. The art fund has been perverted by it. We need, I really do think, the boy, I will see myself in that role, to call out the emperor's new clothes. So that's one part of the story of the disaster of what seems to me has happened in the 20th century and projected into the 21st. And it begins, essentially as the nihilism. One of the other things that we've got to understand is, of course, that the optimism of, for example, the periods on either side of the, particularly after the Second World War, can produce exactly the same effect. If we want an example of the absolute horror of what a deliberate abandonment of the past involves, can I suggest you all go on a walking tour of Coventry? Coventry is an abomination. The rebuilding of the city is a disgrace and a scandal. We can see the architecture is trashy, where it's ornamental, it's twee. It contrives to be both it's very difficult to be both crass and twee at the same time, but it astonishingly succeeds. But ladies and gentlemen, and it's really important we understand this, it may look dystopian, but it was a genuine endeavor to create a utopia. We also need to understand that the spirit behind it was not simply the reaction to the Second World War. To put it more simply, Hitler's firebombs simply did what the planners wanted to do anyway, which was to knock the lot down. And again, we were talking about naming the guilty party. There's a very interesting guilty party. He was a man, and again, we need to understand this, like the original Duchamp, of genuine moral probity and high ideals. He's called, and this again is something that when we work how to do this more fully. He's a man called Donald Gibson, who was the town, and look at this very interesting word, the town and country planner. 5-year plans. That whole we're going to have a new planned economy from this autumn, despite all the evidence as to what they do. He came up with the conclusion that the words are fascinating. That centuries of commercial activity had merely delivered chaos. It is, of course, we've all forgotten this. Coventry was up there with the greatest of the German medieval cities. It was an intact, and remember, Coventry until the end of the 15th century was the most prosperous place in England apart from London. It was an medieval inheritance of staggering quality. Why then is it destroyed? It is destroyed out of an optimism and a belief that a planned, rational world would somehow deliver better. It is, in other words, it is the architectural equivalent of what Burke was talking about with the excesses of the French Revolution. Again, it is the hyper-rationalization, the notion that it's better to start from scratch, that it's better literally to tear down and destroy. And the plain truth was, and you can actually see it from the correspondence, they were rather pleased with the German firebombs in the raids of 1940. I saw a similar example in my, let me tell you the story, because of course you always need, don't you? You need, in the same way, Warhol needed a grander figure. This is really why Duchamp is revived. Duchamp has trails of foreignness, Frenchness, and all the rest of it come in very useful when you're trying to squeeze money out of American heiresses and that sort of thing. In Coventry had its own figure. Believe it or not, when these plans were being presented in 1944 onwards, 3 guesses who was the central, as it were, icon figure. Can anybody think of something absolutely wildly implausible? Well, let me give you a clue. It was an Egyptian pharaoh. Akhenaten. He is the one, you may remember, he's the father of Tutankhamun, as I gather it's now fashionable to call him, and he is the one who moves the capital from Thebes to what is now called Amarna, Tel El Amarna, and conceives of this absolutely new-built city which starts from scratch in a desert. And he is again hailed, this is so 1944, 1945, he is hailed as, let me get all these the right way around, he is hailed as the first town planner, the first monotheist, and the first pacifist. So all of these things, there's even a sermon given on him by the then Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, hailing this extraordinary figure. And of course, the bishop begins his sermon by saying, wasn't it a good thing that the cathedral had been knocked down as they wanted a fresh start? It is totally extraordinary. And can I invite you to compare that the appalling products, that insane, rootless, Robespierre-like, these are the Robespierres of architecture, that rootless innovation with what happens in Eastern Europe, where you rebuild. Warsaw the ghetto is rebuilt. Do you know what's actually going on? Does anybody know what the wicked Viktor Orban is doing at the moment in Budapest? He is rebuilding Buda. Buda as it was in 1939, that stunning combination of the Baroque city of the 18th century and the grandiosity of Franz Josef's Austria. It's absolutely, well, astonishing. My example is in my little town in the north of England, Kendal. Kendal was not bombed. But in the 1960s, there was an unholy combination of our local officer of health, a man called, wonderful name, Dr. Madge, along with the borough surveyor, who was called Lefevre, very appropriate, Madge and Lefevre, and they deliberately persuaded the town council to knock half the town down. Kendal was again, like, it wasn't as old, or most of it wasn't as old as Coventry, but it was a completely preserved 17th, 18th and 19th century working city. Town, very, very large town. The parish church is one of the largest of England. I know I had to try and fill it with my voice when I was playing Becket and Murder in the Cathedral. So its dimensions are written in my mind. And they, of course, got in a fashionable architect to do their dirty for them, Fred Gibbard, who is responsible for the absurdities of the Wigwam Cathedral in Liverpool. Now, the role again of the architect in all of this is a fascinating one, and again, I'm going to stop now because I've teased in. Now I'm going to stop very shortly. I think I've teased sufficiently. There's the work of a rather interesting chap called James Stevens Curl on making dystopia, looking at the particular consequences of modernism. Because, of course, modernism in architecture, Le Corbusier and whatever, were, again, the deliberate attempt at the severance of tradition. And as it were, the destruction exactly as Duchamp had wanted, the destruction of any notion of beauty, any notion of art, any notion of historic continuity. And the result, of course, is written all over our landscape. I mean, go and walk along Knightsbridge and look at the Knightsbridge Barracks, the creation of one of the followers of this lot, Basil Spence. It is a building of such horror. It is about 20 stories high, looming over Knightsbridge and Hyde Park. And the thing, again, as Curl points out, it should be an architecture of verticality. Instead, all the emphases are horizontal. So it has the charm of a rather badly constructed chocolate layer cake. The aesthetic is that of a chocolate layer cake. It is an abomination. I remember vividly, going back to my days, again, of the establishment, Starkey, of sitting on the Blue Plaque Committee, and we had a perpetual sort of deceased wife's sister argument about Basil Spence, in which there would be fanatics of the 20th century society trying to get him to have a blue plaque, and every sensible person saying what he'd built was monstrous. And I, being, of course, a figure essentially of compromise, tried to put forward the idea that we should actually have double inscriptions on blue plaques. And I proposed that his plaque should have architect and vandal. Which would be exactly true and a complete sum. And unfortunately, because the blue plaques were governed by the 19th century notion of exemplary lives, it was rejected. My other joke, and this will lead me finally into my great point of contrast with all of this. My other joke was, again, we had an annual, that annual blister marriage with deceased wife's sister. We had a similar one with Ezra Pound, the poet, because, of course, of his fascist links. So I said, very simple solution, poet and fascist. This, unfortunately, would be completely accurate description, was by these idiot people rejected. But, of course, Ezra Pound is the key figure who helps Eliot in The Wasteland. And this is where, of course, you get a work of conscious modernism, which seems to me one of value comparable with all the preceding great works of English literature. Why? Because it remains in conscious dialogue with them. Eliot takes a wildly different view. He taught those opening lines about measuring lives that lived in coffee spoons and all the rest of it. It's exactly that sense of destruction, erosion of value and whatever, but there is the constant backwards and forwards using other literary examples, other forms of language and so on. And again, even more in a work that I would like, as it were, I began with Chaucer, I would actually like to end with what seems to me the best of Eliot, which isn't The Waste Land, it's the Four Quartets, and it's Little Gidding, that extraordinary poem in which he talks about the experience of being in an ancient English church, not grand, not like Westminster Abbey, but just having that sense of the footsteps that have walked there over 1,000 years. And he invokes it by using a man that I mentioned last week, Thomas Eliot, his 16th century predecessor, and he does it in a fashion which seems to me that moves my heart in a way which most people find only religion does. And it is there, it seems to me, a form of modernism, which is also, bizarrely, a form of conservatism. Well, he was being advised by a fascist, I suppose, when he was doing it, which is a form of conservatism, which is the ability with Eliot to do exactly what Le Corbusier can't and won't, what Duchamp can't and won't, what Warhol can't and won't, which is to have, even within the frame of modernity, the disintegration, the destruction, the cultural fragmentation, because he is in conscious dialogue with the past. I suppose language holds you into that to an extent, but still he does it astonishingly. And I cannot read Little Gidding without weeping. If one is to search, there's this great struggle at the moment to find what is the core, the surviving core of a conservatism. Many people on the right are trying to come forward with the idea that you can only have a conservatism if it's founded in religion. I do not believe that is possible, and certainly not in a country as naturally irreligious as England, and whose religion anyway was always dominated by the state, or for 500 years was Erastian. But what Eliot offers, and this is the perfect complement to Chaucer, he offers a kind of historical transcendence, a modernity which doesn't dismiss the past and create something which actually you might want to live for and build on. Thank you.